All right, we'll start this webinar. I want to be respectful of everybody's time. Thank you for joining us today. So my name is Edouard Clément. I'm the Executive Director at the Energy Mining Hub. This is our third webinar introducing the Open Insight suite of tools and models. Today we're going to explore a different world with the M3 EnergyABM. It's always great to have you attending those meetings. This will be recorded and we'll be sharing that on our website as well. Feel free to use the Q&A box during the presentation to ask any questions you might have to the team here. Today I'll be, and if you want, Devin, go to the next slide, just introducing the EMH team as well and the content of today's presentation. So I think most of you might already know about EMH. We are a consortium of Canadian University working in the open source tools and data to support evidence-based policy making. EMH is composed of those institutions, and we are supported by NRCan and recently have been made a technical partner of the ARENA Long-Term Scenarios Energy Transition Network. If you want to know more, of course, I'll invite you to visit our website and subscribe to our newsletters. I don't want to take too much time on this, so I'll let now Devin Azevedo, Brendan Danaher, and Dan Eshif-Oder present today's webinar on the EnergyABM models. Guys, the floor is yours.
Great. Thanks very much, Edward, and thanks everybody for joining. My name is Devin Azevedo. I'm project director of Open Insights, which I'll talk a bit more about in a second. But I also want to first give a bit more context to, I guess, this webinar, adding on to what Edward was just mentioning. So today we're going to be sharing more about three models focused on upstream energy sectors: oil, gas, and electricity. And this set of models is a bit different from previous models and integrated models we've released previously within Open Insights, both because of the methodology, which we'll get into more as we go in to this session, but also because these models have been developed in collaboration with Macrocosm Group, a spin-off company from University of Oxford, and Dan Ecclesdorfer has been kind enough to join us, a CEO of Macrocosm, to help answer any questions that you may have throughout, or particularly we'll reserve some time towards the end of the session. It's been kind of a really fun and unique collaboration with Macrocosm. So Macrocosm's been developing these models for the past, I guess, year and a half now, or at least in collaboration with us for a year and a half, maybe a bit longer on their side. And they have a really strong in-house oil and gas expertise, as well as experience with electricity markets. So they kind of bring some international expertise in those sectors that then we've brought together to make these models for Canadian applications. And so over the past few months, the CECIT and Open Insights team and Energy Modeling Hub teams have been kind of onboarding onto these models that have been developed by Macrocosm. Brendan being one of those modelers who's going to share some of the illustrative results we have from them later in the session. And our teams are becoming kind of what is called like practitioners of these models, but the original developers being Macrocosm Group. So that's just some additional context behind the model and the process of developing the models. And then before going into the actual content of the session, I'll just quickly run through what we're planning to share with you. So I'll give a quick update on the overall Open Insights project. I think most people on the call have seen, at least in some form, previous versions of us talking about Open Insights. So I'll just give an update on where we're at within the project. Then do a quick motivation for why we're developing these new models, in particular within the Open Insights project. Then give an overview of the methodology, show you some illustrative results, and then we'll leave time, kind of dedicated time for Q&A. But please, if you've attended these before, you'll know that we very much encourage any questions through the Q&A or chat function, and then if we see them at the right time, we'll maybe answer them kind of as we go, or if we don't, or if it doesn't really make sense timing wise, we'll come back to them at the end. So then I will get into the first kind of bit of content, which is just on updates from Open Insights. So Anybody who attended previous webinars that we've done might recall that one of our last webinars was over the summer, introducing this integrated Sims Copper Silver model, which integrates the Sims energy system model with kind of detailed power system representation. And so that's been released, as you may be aware. All the code is open source. Documentation is open source at the links provided in that first box on this slide. And then the thing kind of to update on is that we've started to apply those integrated models in collaborative projects with a few nonprofits and industry associations. Those will be released early next year. And all the I mean, the code's already open source, but the results and assumptions used will also be fully released. So I'd appreciate if you keep an eye out for that. Then through the Open Insights and M3 platform work, we've also enhanced the coders database, as well as been doing work on the visualization tool idea that we use to look at results from these models. So some links there that provide some examples of that. And then our main next steps, which this session is very much, or the model we'll focus on in this session is very much part of, is we're, as you may recall from any previous sessions you've seen on Open Insights, one of our big goals within this project is to create a new fully open source integrated energy economy model with granularity in the sectors that really matter for Canada. And so we've kind of completed early versions of that full kind of integrated macroeconomy, labor market, energy system model, primarily focused on validation right now. And the first half of 2026, we'll be releasing that open source. And then this last box, another major next step and focus of ours will be then using that integrated model to do additional new collaborations with nonprofits and industry associations next year, as well as start to do kind of what we're calling rapid response analysis of any updates to climate plans by provinces or the federal government, and for any elections, starting to do the same for climate platforms. So that's a quick recap of what we've been focused on for the past few months, as well as the high level next steps. And with that, I'll start to go into the actual content of this session, which is focused on the model we're calling for now, the EnergyABM. So as a quick, focus on or start on why we're developing and have been working with Macrocosm to develop this model. The motivation has kind of been, I guess, slightly separate for why we've been developed a new model for electricity sector, and then slightly separate motivation for doing the same for oil and gas. For the electricity system, as some people on the call might already be familiar, Open Insights has other power sector focused models such as copper and silver, but they're provincial level optimization models and don't necessarily have the granularity or kind of detailed representation of market dynamics to robustly investigate kind of key policy impacts on key competitive metrics like firm profitability. And so they're appropriate for looking at some questions in certain lenses, but particularly when we're looking at competitiveness impacts of something like ITCs, industrial pricing, they're not always the best tool for the job. And related to that, as far as we're aware, there's no open source models in Canada that enable kind of self-consistent insights across kind of all relevant levels of the energy sector. So like going from assets, firms, to the market, region, country, enabling there's, I guess, no open source models that allow for kind of modeling all that in kind of one go. So I'll come back to that in a second of why that's important to us. And then for the oil and gas sector, there's a similar limitation on whole economy optimization frameworks, such as Message Canada, which is something our team has been working on as well, in investigating competitive impacts of oil and gas policy questions. But then perhaps even more importantly, as far as we're aware, there's no open source kind of detailed oil and gas models available in Canada. So we really want to plug that gap, I guess, both for our own analysis, but also kind of for the whole modeling community in Canada. And then maybe one last thing that applies then both or all three of electricity, oil, and gas. Uh, Something that we've really found in our work, and I'm sure other modelers find, is that uh, runtime matters not run model runtime matters not just because it's frustrating to wait for a model to run, but also because, of course, the more iterations you can do, the more sense checking you can do, the more kind of policies you can add. And so, for example, Copper right now, although actually improvements have been made recently, but it still takes a few hours to run on cloud resources. The types of models that I'll start, or that the models that we're going to introduce today are significantly less than that, taking like half an hour to 1 hour on a laptop. Um, so that also uh, is something we've been focused on. And then zooming out a bit, why particularly that last one of those last points on oil and gas, there not being an open source oil and gas model option within Canada, why that matters particularly to the open sites objectives is where, again, as mentioned previously, and perhaps you've seen in previous presentations, we're trying to build this M3 platform that as we call it, which covers all relevant systems when it comes to climate policy, so economic systems, energy systems, and then detailed representation of power systems. And up until now, we just haven't had a detailed option for the oil and gas sector. And so these models, again, plug that gap. So that's all kind of the motivation for why we've worked with Macrocosm Group to build a model that tracks firms and asset balance sheets to allow for analysis of things like firm profitability in response to new energy or climate policy. Second, and kind of very much building off of that first point, a set of models that allows for bottom-up assessment and allows for emergent market dynamics rather than kind of imposing certain assumptions on how markets have to behave, which ends up being the case in many optimization or CGE frameworks. And then that allows for price investment to result from decisions made within the model rather than kind of being set, according to some rule, like a kind of optimal distribution according to a high level kind of equation that covers the whole model. And then, of course, a primary motivating factor behind why we've developed these is to have an open source option when it comes particularly to oil and gas sector modeling. So now I'll start to get into the actual methodology of what's been developed. I'll only do this in, I can't remember exactly how many slides, but a limited number of slides. So of course, there's a lot more detail that can be gone into here. So if you're interested, as always, please just reach out if you want more details. And maybe actually one thing I'll mention, since I think this is the first slide of the content slides where we mentioned the name of the framework. The name for now is EnergyABM, so that stands for Energy Agent-Based Model. We recently received some feedback questioning whether that's kind of the best naming for the model. Primarily a bit of an academic point, but just I guess in case anybody else on the call is kind of interpreting the ABM title in this way, sometimes people think of ABMs as a model that has interactions directly between agents in the model. That's actually not what we have here. In here, they interact just through a market, so there's no kind of like within the model agents bumping into each other and transferring behavioral rules or anything like that. What we're just doing here is, as you'll start to see on this slide, firms and assets compete within markets, and they only interact in that way. So it's been suggested to us that perhaps a more apt name would be heterogeneous agent model, but my reluctance with that is that abbreviates to energy ham, and that's a slightly less doesn't feel that serious. So that's all to say. If you have any suggestions for other names, we're very welcome or welcome those suggestions and very open to them. But we're also doing some thinking on our side. Anyways, for now it's called EnergyABM, and the structure of the model tries to represent, I guess, the real structure of markets. So you have assets, particularly, we'll show this on another slide, but for the electricity and oil applications of this framework in particular, we have all assets that exist in Canada, at least that there's public information on. we have those maps to firms that own those assets, and then the markets that those firms and assets compete in, and firms can participate in multiple markets, as sort of represented in the stylized framework here. And so each of those kind of components do different things. So assets are the produce energy, participate in markets, like make bids, face evolving costs, deplete their resources. Firms own those assets, make forecasts, and based on those forecasts, make investments, make decisions to enter or exit a market. And then within the market, we have different rules that you can apply basically on how that market functions. But ultimately, there's some kind of attempt, at least, of matching supply and demand. And of course, price gets determined at the market level. And by markets, particularly in Canada, when it comes to electricity, for now, that's just set up like at a provincial level. So you can kind of think of those as, at least for electricity, those markets are for each province. So that's the kind of structure of the entities that exist within the model. Then just to illustrate exactly how at a high level, how the model actually operates, which starts to get at, or will start to illustrate, particularly for the modelers on the call, how this differs from other modeling frameworks. I'm just going to walk you through the high level kind of sequence of events that happens within the EnergyABM framework. So there's a set of obviously exogenous, as there always is, some exogenous assumptions. In this case, demand projections are one of the major assumptions going in. You also give it data on assets and who they're owned by, as well as resource endowments. So obviously for oil and gas, it's the reserves of the assets, but then for electricity, that includes VRE resources in particular. And then within each model period, and by period, for example, for gas, this is done on a monthly level. For electricity, of a mix of hourly, daily, you have assets bidding. You can have different bid functions for each asset if that's what you want. Assets submit bids to the market. So that's how much they are willing to supply at a given price. And then within that, you have an option for regulated markets, which has a slightly different set of market dynamics that applies. Then you have a market clearing step where the model takes all those bids, basically creates a merit order, or one option within the model is that it'll take a merit order and then use that to match supply and demand and establish a market clearing price. And this is how particularly the model, one of the ways it differs from something like more like a copper-like optimization model, is that then the model and the firms see the price, and then only then understand what their profits will be, exactly what their emissions will be, because now they know how much production they'll actually be kind of asked to do. And then so that's what comes out of the each period of the model. And then for each year is where the firm kind of section of the model comes in. And that's where the firm understands its total profits for the year after the plants have made all their decisions, and seen their outcomes. They see what their firm equity is. Then they make this investment decisions based on that information plus forecasts that they generate. They make their decisions on whether they're going to invest. And then the market structure updates. So, for example, bankrupt firms could exit, or new market entrants enter. And then you have an update of costs evolving over time, according either to input assumptions you've given as the modeler, or according to some evolving trajectory. So there may be two main areas where this differs from something like an optimization framework. One, as you can see in what I already mentioned of the model period section, which is firms then only see their profits and emissions kind of once market dynamics have occurred, as well as investment decisions are made based on firm level forecasts, which can be incorrect, rather than everybody having perfect foresight and making decisions based on that perfect foresight. So I will then get into some of the details of how the three different models uh, differ in how they operate and the data they have. And something I guess I haven't made super clear so far in the presentation is that the energy ABM itself is a like a modeling framework similar to, I guess one could say, like say PIPESA or Message IX. It's a modeling framework that can be applied to initiate different types of models. And so in this case, we have our energy ABM framework that then we apply to create what we call the electricity ABM, the gas ABM, the oil ABM. And so they're all using the same code or same kind of set of functions, and then they get applied to different data sets and initialized in slightly different ways. So the ways that they differ are on time resolution. Electricity ABM operates hourly, gas ABM monthly, oil ABM at an annual level. They have slightly different scopes in terms of geography, also slightly different representations on transmission and trade. They all represent it to some extent, but with different focuses in different areas. For example, more of a focus on international trade in the gas ABM, particularly with the inclusion of LNG export nodes, whereas electricity ABM, for now at least, we just have exogenous international trade patterns with the US. They all include storage, and then market dynamics differ slightly. They all have the same options, but they've all been tailored to better or best represent how markets in those actual sectors operate. I'll leave that one there now, but there's a fair amount of more information there that I could go into and very happy to answer questions on. I probably won't dive too much into detail on this slide, but I really just want to make the point that Macrocosm has done a great job at building this model kind of as modular as possible. So that includes like make it really easy to swap in and out different policies, but also different behavioral rules. So for example, when it comes to how assets bid, there's kind of a default bidding strategy of just based on the firm's marginal cost of production plus some kind of markup. But there's also different options of where they're more focused on using backward-looking information or just some kind of fixed bid that allows the modeler to kind of understand how different strategies may be better mapped to behavior in some specific circumstances. And then something I haven't mentioned yet is how the oil and gas ABMs in particular do abatement. For now, we're mainly just drawing on IEA abatement cost curves. So for now, mainly focused on methane abatement, but that's I'll get to next steps towards the end, and I'll share more on a bit more on that being a next priority to expand that. But by default, and this I mainly include this just to highlight again, perhaps in contrast to some people's preconceived notions of what an energy ABM kind of rules they include. At least in this case, it's pretty simple, straightforward, and kind of like real world decision rules being used. So in this case, to make abatement decisions, each firm just assesses what the present value of an asset with abatement or with an investment in abatement is, compare that to the present value of the old asset, and then they make the decision if there's two different options in the model, if either the NPV or the ROI is higher with the new asset with abatement. So a pretty standard calculation that I think everybody's familiar with, and therefore that's how it's represented in the model. And I think my last slide before I'm going to hand over to Brendan to give us some examples, or no, sorry, two more slides before we go into some illustrative results. So just to give a flavor of how some of the results from these models or the energy ABM framework in general differs from at least some of our Open Insights higher level, more traditional models, is the energy ABM does produce quite a bit of information on firm financials. That's like how number of assets they own over time, their kind of cash balance, revenue, cost of revenue, and the investments they're making. It also tracks trade flows and the destination in some cases of particularly gas ABM of where that trade is headed. Tracks what abatement decisions each firm makes, and then lastly also includes the information perhaps that's more standard on exactly how much each firm and asset type is producing, the reserves left over, the cost of that production and emissions. Um, and then my last slide before handing it over is on kind of what we envision the use cases for this type of model to be. Um, Slightly different between the electricity and oil and gas models. For the electricity model, one of the areas we've kind of noticed some criticism, and particularly like the modeling we've done at times using copper and optimization framework, is that for something like modeling either industrial pricing systems or clean electricity regulations, you don't, using an optimization framework, see the impacts on firm profitability, as mentioned earlier. So that's particularly one of the use cases we plan to use electricity ABM for. It's obviously not a replacement for optimization frameworks. Particularly, this framework isn't designed for like technical economic assessments of, say, the cheapest pathway to net zero. So there's very much still a role of both for both modeling approaches to play. And then for the gas ABM and oil ABM, it's really about, we envision assessing questions around competitiveness of Canadian gas and oil compared to competitors abroad, as well as, I guess, assessing the competitive advantage of certain provinces in some cases. And one thing I want to highlight that we don't anticipate the main use case being for, I guess, across all three of these models is, even though we have firm level data and firm level kind of capability to track how firms kind of fare across time under certain policy regimes, because we're trying to produce models that are fully open source. We've initiated and we're going to be releasing these models with publicly available data. And in that, because of that, it means that we're not leveraging kind of what could be done is taking like proprietary data that maybe costs 80 to 100K to initialize the models with, which then allows you to have the super granular tracking of the real cash balance of a certain firm, the real number of investments made over the past few years. Since we're not doing that, instead of drawing from public sources, we do get, I think, a reasonable approximation of the heterogeneity across firms within each of these sectors. But that also means it's not really appropriate for somebody to dive in, say, specifically to one company like Shell and then say like, okay, this is exactly how the best representation of how Shell's financials are going to look over time. That's not what's the best use case here. The better use case is to zoom out and say, okay, we capture heterogeneity across firms, and we probably do that at a decent level on average. Now, how does kind of certain types of firms within Canada fare or don't, or well, fare over time, either positively or negatively under certain policy regime? So I just want to make that clear that there's a risk of false precision here if you tried to drill into a certain firm, and we'd kind of always caution to be wary of that using this kind of model, and or at least given the data that's publicly available. Okay, with that, I will pass over to my colleague Brendan, who's going to walk us through some illustrative results using the gas ABM.
Thanks, Devin, and thanks for the detailed presentation. I'll get you to keep switching slides for me. Also, EnergyABM, I think it has a nice ring to it. I don't mind that name. But yeah, as Devin said, I'm going to just walk through some very high-level results as we've been starting to kind of dive into the nitty-gritty details with these different models. So for now, I'll focus on the gas ABM, and we've modeled 3 different scenarios. With that being said, these are very high-level scenarios. So simply put, a no policy scenario, as the name explains itself. This will be used like a reference case that we can compare our baseline scenario and then an LNG expansion scenario. So in the baseline scenario, we've included what we're calling an illustrative industrial carbon pricing system. In effect, this is a very, very rough around the edges mimic of the federal output-based pricing system. In that we've modeled emission thresholds and the carbon price, and generators can produce emissions above or below the threshold and generate what we're calling credits, or credits bought or credits sold effectively. However, there is no credit market in the model currently, so that is in essence more of a subsidy or a tax, and what we'll be showing. With that being said, as Devin mentioned earlier, we have abatement investment opportunities included in the model. This is based on the IEA methane marginal based abatement cost curve. However, we will be diving into other abatement opportunities further that Devin, I believe, will touch on later. Lastly, we've modeled an LNG expansion scenario. So again, a very what-if high-level scenario where LNG expansion in British Columbia, we start in 2027 and build out capacity to 2030, reaching an assumed 160,000, a little bit of typo there, meters cubed per day in terms of production and export capacity, simply going to the Chinese market only. So again, a very high-level what-if scenario. And for this scenario too, we've included an illustrative industrial carbon pricing system that I discussed. Next slide, Devin, please. Thanks. So what's great about the gas model is we have monthly demand data in the United States and Canada. So with that being said, we capture seasonality impacts. So in terms of projecting demand forward into the future, we can utilize a cosine function in our demand projection to be able to mimic this seasonality impact. In regions where there is a very low amplitude in terms of that cosine component, we do project forward without that cosine function, so it is a bit more of a flat projection into the future. However, we do include this for all regions in the United States and Canada. In terms of yearly demand, if you go to the next slide, Devin. We have so international demand, we have yearly data parameterized in the model. So when I say international demand, I'm talking a lot of the Asian markets, so China, Japan, South America, Europe, Africa. I'll go into that in a bit more detail in the next slide. But with this being said, since we do have yearly demand data, we don't capture that seasonality component, but at least we can capture the impact of demand internationally on our more domestic production scale. There are regions in the model, such as Russia, where data isn't available, of course, and that hasn't been included. Next slide, please, Devin. So what's really cool about this model is we have 92 regions defined. So 32 of these regions are fully exogenous. So when I say fully exogenous, I mean that they have North American demand parameterized only, in the sense that they're not exporting gas to North America or LNG to North America, but they will import it. So we have that North American component of the historical imports parameterized in the model. However, there are 60 regions competing in the sense that they can produce, import, and export gas within the model. And this is what we're seeing right here. So it's really interesting in the sense that we can see and mimic real world trade between nodes. So we can look at Texas, for example, and see its interties with Louisiana and Mexico, or look at British Columbia and see its interties with Alberta, Washington, and Idaho. And for an example scenario, this is our LNG expansion scenario. We can look at a very high level what if BC LNG export scenario going to the Chinese market. And exactly, thanks Devin, that's perfect, yeah. We can explore the production impacts of a what if BC LNG expansion scenario. So comparing that to a baseline scenario, we can see in our baseline scenario where we don't have any capacity increasing in the province, again, for this use case, we see a relatively static and flat production trajectory going forward. However, in our LNG expansion scenario, it's very interesting because we see in 2027 to 2030, production scale up in terms of LNG export. However, after this point, we do still see growth, and this growth is driven by the Chinese demand. So if we go to the next slide, Devin, we can see the interties between different nodes in terms of Chinese demand. So before our LNG expansion starts, we see that China, in 2025, our model was projecting China to import all of its LNG from Texas. So historically, LNG came from Louisiana, Texas, and so forth. But this is what our model's projecting for 2025 and 2026. However, we've purposely parameterized in the model BC LNG cost in our very what-if scenario to be cheaper than Texas. And we see build out and a transition in terms of China importing LNG now from British Columbia And in 2030, that is the 100% sole importing region. It's this is really awesome because it gives us the ability to investigate cost and capacity sensitivities and the impact on other firms and regions. So again, we've only parameterized one node or one region importing gas from British Columbia. However, when we do build up this model further, we'll be able to actually look at different Asian markets importing LNG from British Columbia, and it can let us look at different costs, different tariffs, different effects on BC LNG in these regions, and how demand projections in those regions affects our LNG production domestically. So switching gears now away from this LNG expansion scenario, more so looking at production by province over time. So for this use case, I've showcased Alberta, Saskatchewan, and British Columbia, just to simplify things for this presentation. And we have our baseline where we include our illustrative industrial pricing system and then our no policy scenario. So it's very interesting that in our initial, again, very high level results, production doesn't vary under both scenarios. This is driven by demand and capacity constraints. So the model is signaling to us that, for example, in Alberta and British Columbia, in the early 2030s, we're actually hitting maximum production capacity. So regardless if the policy is active or not, we do see production hitting this kind of upper bound and then staying there for the rest of the model horizon. Alberta does see this small drop and then spike back up in 2024. This is simply based on our demand projection having a small kind of step in the function going from historical demand to projected demand. It's something that we already know that we can fix and play with and investigate further in the model. And Saskatchewan's an interesting example because this is a region which doesn't hit an upper bound in terms of production capacity. So from a bidding perspective and a cost perspective, we see that again in these very high level initial results that Saskatchewan isn't producing very much gas and does scale up over time. As these other regions hit their maximum capacity, more gas is required from a demand perspective in the gas system. So next slide, Devin. An interesting result, though, is under the two scenarios, we do see a significant change in emissions. This makes sense because of abatement investments that we've included in the model. So when we have our illustrative industrial pricing scenario, we see Alberta and British Columbia, for example, invest significantly in methane abatement opportunities. There is a small caveat with this in the sense that according to the IEA marginal abatement cost curve for methane reduction technologies, there are two technologies that have negative investment costs. So in essence, you could say they're free or they actually make money if you invest in them. That's why both scenarios do see this initial drop at the beginning in emissions. However, we do see again Alberta go back up in the no policy scenario, whereas emissions continue to decrease in our baseline or scenario where we've included our industrial carbon pricing policy. So with that being said, we can now look at how these drop in emissions are related to these abatement investments and in terms of generating credits or so credits bought and credits sold. And that'll be on the next slide here, Devin. Thanks. So with that being said, with us seeing Alberta having a significant decrease in its emission intensity and same with British Columbia, we see a significant increase in what we're calling credits sold in the model. Again, there is no credit market model currently, so that's more, you could say, a subsidy. But with that being said, Alberta and British Columbia are actually generating money, whereas Saskatchewan, unfortunately, given its abatement investment, the fact that it's not as strategic of a gas producing region, we see this region being taxed further and having to buy credits to offset its emissions. And we can see those specific abatement investments in the next slide. So what's really interesting about this is we can see when the model is strategically choosing to invest in abatement opportunities. We're not forcing the model to invest in abatement opportunities at any time. It's only the policy that's driving this. So again, as I said, there are two technologies that have this negative investment cost in terms of abatement opportunities. That being replacing pumps and blowdown capture. However, the model is then projecting in future years that one each region should be invested in, for example, leak detection and replacement, or leak detection and repair, I should say. And the different amounts based on their emission intensity and long-term strategic forecast in that current year. So the model does have a 10-year period where it looks forward into the future based on what policies are active and what carbon price, and mimics, you could say, the firm saying, we think we need to invest in this much and hopefully this will help us out in the future. So you see that happen in 2024 and 2025, for example, in Alberta. So the model gives us the opportunity to investigate lots of other different components. As Devin was touching on earlier, we can dive deep into the firm financials and look at each firm's balance sheet. We can look at the effects of fuel price on the energy system and so forth. But for this high-level scenario and showcase of this results, given the time constraints of this presentation, we wanted to just showcase these initial results to be able to give a perspective of we're starting to dive deep into the model now and starting to explore things. And these are some of the things we can explore and some of the questions we can answer, for example, with the gas model. But also we can do similar stuff with the electricity ABM and the oil ABM as well. So exciting things to come.
Great, thanks very much, Brendan. There's two questions in the chat that I have one final next step slide, but I figure we might as well take the questions on the results that you just presented, Brendan. The first one is, what's the motivation for parameterizing export LNG costs to be cheaper in BC compared to Texas? Is this from CER or EIA, or was this for the what if scenario?
This was simply just for a what-if scenario. We just wanted to explore and see that we could actually do it. Again, we're still early days in this model, so the actual cost component of what we were parameterizing in terms of LNG export doesn't really have any merit or any, let's say, academic reason behind it right now. It's more so for us showcasing model functionality and being able to say, look, we can explore this further, and we will explore this further as we gather more data and parameterize the model further.
Yeah, I'll maybe add I'll just add to that
Yeah.
I mean, we did take that number from a source, but yeah, we haven't like investigated it enough to be like, that is our assessment is that's the best source compared to others. So yeah, it wasn't pulled out of thin air, but yeah, not one that we're gonna say that we've done our due diligence on.
Thanks, Devin. Probably should have made that a bit more clear, but yeah.
No, all good. Cool. Then next one, is there any investigation into the domestic cost of natural gas that occurs in the baseline versus LNG expansion scenarios? This was a component of the DOE's report on energy economic and environmental assessment of the USA LNG exports report from last year. If the asker remembers correctly, they commented on that domestic supply isn't necessarily going to grow at the same rate as LNG export capacity, which could lead to higher domestic natural gas prices. Thanks for the great presentation. Maybe I can give a quick answer to that, Brendan, and feel free to add anything. So yes, the model, something we haven't actually touched on, but the model does, or I guess I mentioned in the kind of methodology slides, we didn't show results on it. The model does calculate the price within each market for each of the commodities that are looked at in each of the different models. So gas is very much included in that. So yeah, it's definitely possible then to look at how, especially if you kind of force the model to export a certain amount of LNG, how that potentially impacts domestic prices of natural gas. We haven't played around enough to kind of confirm that we definitely see that dynamic, I'd say, in these scenarios, but it's definitely something the model is capable of doing. Anything you want to add to that, Brendan?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head there.
Great. And then last question that's in the Q&A, but of course, very much encourage anybody else to drop in questions as well. Can the sectoral models be run simultaneously to deliver sector coupling insights? For example, gas prices informing electricity markets. I'll answer that one. Again, Brendan, feel free to add. For now, no, but it's something we've talked a lot about. I know Dan at my Macrocosm, we've talked about it before, and I know it's I think on your guy, I think probably on both of our roadmaps to include. So that's definitely a next step, but not yet. And I mean, as you can imagine, like it's pretty easy to imagine how you would link these together. It's just something not something we've gotten to yet.
Yeah, no, exactly. I think also too, like, that is to be said. Also, a lot of like the purpose of having these endogenous linkages with a model such as Sims and so forth to be able to investigate that further and run iterative scenarios to go back and forth.
Yeah, absolutely. That's very much the vision behind this, like that slide I showed earlier of that kind of ultimate vision of building this integrated platform is exactly to allow to answer that kind of question. And of course, well, this is true for anybody, but Mohammed, since you asked it, of course, very keen to chat about collaborating on any version of those linkages if that's of interest. Great. Definitely feel free to continue to ask questions in the Q&A as we got a bit more time. But in the meantime, I'll go to our last kind of content slide and then maybe pass it over to Edward to also do any wrap up. But on next steps, we kind of have four priority next steps. One, as Brendan mentioned a few times, like obviously we're very intentionally just framing the scenarios we show now as illustrative scenarios because there's a few things we want to improve before we start to call them anything more than an illustrative scenario. And that's particularly around our representation of some of the most relevant policies for the sectors. So industrial pricing, like we have all the benchmarks and kind of all the data we need to do that. Just need to actually integrate that into the model. Particularly for oil and gas, kind of improve representation of royalty regimes. We want to do that before releasing the model, and then similar for just improving and testing the kind of capacity for accurately representing the impacts of methane regulations and ITCs and perhaps a few other policies. So that's a big, as well as enhancing the abatement cost curves to add a bit more granularity, particularly on the CO2 abatement side. So that's one of the main next steps. We're planning or aiming to release the Canadian versions of these models in early 2026. We'll also, as part of that release, be applying this model in a collaborative report with a partnering industry association or think tank that we're still confirming that with. But that'll, of course, once done, be all released open source. And then very much to the points we were making in response to Mohammed, your question, we'll be integrating this. There's some short-term steps as well as long-term steps with this, but integrating these models with some of the existing models within the M3 platform. Particularly, like one example is, as some people on the call may be familiar, there's already a Sims copper integration, which is a Sims full energy, particularly demand side representation integrated with a detailed power sector model. Or planning to do something similar with the electricity ABM as well as the other two models as well. I see we got one more question. Oh yeah, Pascal on presenting, I guess, results specifically on electricity ABM. No, we haven't actually done that. We chose here to focus on, it was kind of in our mind slightly arbitrary between gas or oil, just because that's kind of to be honest, newer focus of Open Insights and our kind of research. But if there's interest in a electricity ABM focused session, we'd be more than happy to deliver that. So yeah, perhaps Edward and I will chat about when that would make sense, but that's really helpful to know that would be of interest because we'd be more than happy to do that. Great, and then Hung, just reading your question out, and then I'll aim to answer it. Yeah, so in terms of the parameterization of the firms in this model, it differs slightly between each application of the model, but electricity ABM maybe is a good place to start. In that case, we're using the Coders data set, which is a fully open source asset level data set of all the generators within Canada. So that mimics, I guess, the composition of what assets firms own. Though something it doesn't give us is like some more of the firm financials of exactly what about that balance sheet of of those firms look like. So there's kind of a mix of some assumptions as well as some kind of true data that goes into that. And then in terms of the model allowing for an endogenous shift between industries as a result of an energy policy shock, I'd say that's more that kind of this last bullet we're showing on the slides of once we integrate this model with kind of broader energy system models, as well as something we haven't mentioned here, Bahung, I know you're familiar with, is that we're also planning to integrate this with a macro agent-based model to have some more kind of a whole economy feedbacks. I think that's where, once we achieve that, which is the first half of 2026, is when we'd be releasing something around that. That's what will allow for us to get more at endogenous shifts across industries. These models, at least on their own, are a bit more just like what technologies are being invested in within a given sector, with demand then being for that commodity being exogenous. Dan or Brendan, feel free to add to that, but I saw some head nods. I think we're in agreement. Great. We can come back if there's any more questions. We can come back to it, but perhaps in the meantime, I'll pass it back to Edward to do any wrap up until then.
Amazing. Thank you, Devin, Brendan, Dan, for this. Always appreciated to see the level of work that goes into those models. I think the key message here is that, as we're developing those models, we're looking for partners and beta testers. So if you are interested, feel free to reach out to me, to Devin, via EMH website or those slides as well. So we are also expecting to use those models in future iteration of the multi-model comparison forum in the years to come. And of course, there's always a opportunity to collaborate on linking those tools with others as well, or to add more data. So feel free to reach out to us. Feedback is always welcome. This is one model out of the suite that we're building and supporting. So feel free to visit the M3 platform on a regular basis for news and upside. Same thing with Coders. So Coders, this is the main database that's now was released. A new version of Coders was released a few weeks ago, along with this Open Insight Association database, which I think it's great, and and we're also doing improvement on a regular basis. And if any other ideas for collaboration or project, feel free to reach out to us. So this webinar was recorded. We'll post it on the webinar webpage, which you can find on our website as well. And in the meantime, again, never hesitate to reach out to us. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you for the teams. And if there's no more questions, we'll call it a day. Thank you so much for coming today. Stay safe and see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.